Before you settle into tonight's story, make yourself as comfortable as you can. Perhaps your blanket feels warm against your shoulders. Perhaps there is the gentle hum of a fan nearby, or the quiet whisper of rain beyond your window. However your evening sounds, let them become part of this peaceful journey. Tonight, we travel to the eastern edge of America, to a place where the Atlantic Ocean stretches farther than anyone can see, to a quiet peninsula called Cape Cod. Long before highways, electric lights, and busy seaside towns, there were only sandy paths, weathered cottages, fishing boats rocking gently upon the tide, and tall white lighthouses whose faithful beams swept across the darkness every night. This is not a story of danger. It is not a story of great battles. It is simply the story of one gentle man, one faithful lighthouse, and the peaceful rhythm of the sea. So close your eyes if you wish. Take one slow breath and let the waves carry you back nearly 200 years. The first sound anyone noticed on Cape Cod was never a voice. It was always the sea. Long before the fishing boats pushed away from their docks, long before the gulls circled above the harbor, long before smoke curled from the chimneys of little cottages, the Atlantic Ocean was already awake. Its waves rolled toward the shore with patient certainty. They had done so yesterday. They would do so tomorrow. And they had done so for thousands upon thousands of years. The sea never hurried. It simply arrived, again and again. Upon the outer edge of the cape stood a lighthouse. Its tower was painted white. Its lantern room shone with polished glass. Its black iron railing circled the top like a careful embrace. Even in daylight, the lighthouse watched over the sea. The villagers often said that the tower had its own quiet heart. It listened to every tide. It remembered every season. It greeted every sunrise. And every evening, when darkness settled across the water, its lantern became the brightest star a sailor could hope to find. Not far from that lighthouse stood a small keeper's cottage. Its roof was gray with age. Wild roses climbed along one fence. A narrow garden grew carrots, onions, herbs, and lavender that perfumed the salty air whenever the breeze drifted inland. A white cat named Clover often slept beneath the kitchen window, where the afternoon sunshine lingered the longest. Inside the cottage lived a young assistant keeper named Elias Morgan. He was 24 years old. His hair was the color of chestnuts after rain. His hands were strong from polishing brass, carrying oil, and climbing hundreds of winding steps each day. But despite his work, his movements were never rushed. He believed every task deserved patience, even sweeping the front calf, even watering the lavender, even folding blankets, especially lighting the lantern, for Elias believed that somewhere beyond the horizon someone might be waiting to see that light, someone he would never meet, someone whose safe arrival depended upon a small flame carefully tended by unseen hands. It made every evening feel quietly important. Every morning began almost exactly the same. Before dawn painted the sky, Elias awoke to the distant sound of waves. He opened the cottage window. Cool ocean air drifted inside. Sometimes the breeze carried the scent of salt, sometimes seaweed,
sometimes fresh rain crossing the Atlantic. He always smiled. The sea smelled different every day, yet somehow it always smelled like home. He dressed slowly, pulled on wool socks, buttoned his linen shirt, tied sturdy boots, then stepped outside just as the eastern sky became pale silver. The lighthouse stood waiting, its long shadow stretched across the grass. The tower looked almost blue beneath the early morning light. Elias placed one gentle hand upon its weathered stone wall. "Good morning," he whispered. No one heard him, except, perhaps, the lighthouse, if buildings could listen, and perhaps they could. Inside, a spiral staircase curled upward, 112 steps. Elias knew every one. The first creaked softly. The 19th felt smoother beneath his boots. The 42nd always caught the morning sunlight through a tiny window. The 73rd echoed more loudly than all the others. By the time he reached the lantern room, the world spread in every direction. The Atlantic shimmered beneath the rising sun. Fishing boats floated like tiny toys. Seabirds glided effortlessly upon invisible winds. Far away, seals rested on sandbars that disappeared whenever the tide returned. Elias opened the lantern room windows. Fresh air flowed inside. The great Fresnel glass sparkled with thousands of tiny reflections. Every morning he cleaned it carefully, not because anyone watched, not because someone inspected his work, but because he believed beautiful things deserved careful hands. He polished every pane of glass until it caught the sunlight like crystal. He dusted every brass fitting until it glowed warmly. He trimmed the lamp's wick with patient precision. Nothing was hurried, nothing was forgotten. By the time he finished, the lantern looked ready to greet another evening. When his morning duties ended, Elias walked into the village. The path wound between dunes covered in beach grass. Wild rabbits darted quietly through the sand. Tiny purple flowers nodded in the breeze. The village itself was small, perhaps 30 cottages, a general store, a blacksmith's workshop, a little church with a white steeple, a schoolhouse where children's laughter drifted through open windows. Everyone knew everyone else. Mrs. Hathaway baked bread every Tuesday. Old Captain Briggs carved little wooden whales whenever storms kept him ashore. Young Samuel delivered milk with such enthusiasm that he often spilled half of it before reaching his customers. No one seemed terribly bothered. Life moved gently here. Mistakes were simply folded into another day. As Elias entered the bakery, warm aromas wrapped around him. Fresh bread, cinnamon, honey cakes, apple tarts toppling on wooden shelves. Mrs. Hathaway looked up with a cheerful smile. "Morning, Elias." "Good morning. The sea behaving today?" He laughed softly. "So far." She nodded knowingly. "It has its moods." "The sea always does." She handed him a loaf still warm from the oven. The crust crackled gently as it cooled. "There you are. Thank you. And tell your lighthouse I said good morning." Elias smiled. "I will." She laughed, though she wasn't entirely joking. Around here, people spoke to the lighthouse as much as they spoke to one another. That afternoon, clouds drifted lazily across a brilliant blue sky. The harbor remained calm. Fishing boats returned one by one. Children searched tide pools for tiny crabs. Women gathered seashells along the shore. Old fishermen repaired their nets while telling stories they each had told dozens of times before. No one minded hearing them again. Stories, after all, were like waves. They returned because they belonged. Often Elias sat on a smooth driftwood log overlooking the sea. Beside him rested Clover, the white cat. Neither seemed interested in speaking. They simply watched. A seal surfaced briefly before disappearing beneath the water. Far away, a whale breathed, sending a silver mist into the afternoon sunlight. The gulls floated effortlessly overhead. Everything seemed exactly where it belonged. The sky, the sea, the lighthouse, the village, the wind, even silence.
Even silence had found its proper place. As evening slowly approached, the entire coastline began to change. The sunlight softened into gold. Long shadows stretched across the dunes. The ocean reflected colors no painter could fully capture. Blue, silver, amber, rose, soft lavender. The lighthouse stood taller somehow beneath the evening sky. Its white walls glowed gently in the fading light. Elias climbed the spiral staircase once more, 112 familiar steps. He carried fresh lamp oil carefully. The lantern room waited in quiet anticipation. He checked the mechanism, filled the reservoir, adjusted the wick, polished one final fingerprint from the great lens. Outside, darkness gathered almost unnoticed. One by one, the first stars appeared, then another, then dozens. The horizon slowly disappeared into the night. At exactly the right moment, Elias struck a small match. Its tiny flame flickered gently. He touched it to the wick. The lamp awakened. Golden light blossomed inside the great lens. The magnificent Fresnel glass gathered that light, strengthened it, focused it, and sent a brilliant beam sweeping slowly across the sleeping Atlantic. Round and round it turned, patient, steady, faithful. Far beyond the horizon, sailors looked toward the shore. Some smiled, some quietly whispered, "Cape Cod." Home was still many miles away, but the light told them they were on the right course, and that was enough. Elias watched the beam complete another graceful circle, then another. The ocean answered with its endless whisper, wave after wave, breath after breath, night after peaceful night. And as the lighthouse shone into the darkness, it seemed less like a building and more like an old friend, keeping watch while the rest of the world slowly drifted into sleep. The night passed quietly. The great lantern continued its patient circle above the sea. Far below, gentle waves brushed against the sandy shore as though they had nowhere else they wished to be. The stars crossed slowly overhead. One by one, they drifted westward until the darkest hours began to soften. Long before the first hint of sunrise, Elias Morgan awoke once again. He needed no clock, no bell, no rooster. The sea itself had become his morning companion. Even with his eyes still closed, he could hear the familiar rhythm. Wave, pause, wave, pause. It sounded almost like breathing, a deep, peaceful breath shared by the ocean itself. Elias sat quietly upon the edge of his small wooden bed. He never hurried to begin the day. Instead, he waited for a single moment of silence. It was a habit he had learned from the old lighthouse keeper who had first trained him many years before. Every morning, the old keeper had once said, the world offers one perfectly quiet moment. If you listen carefully enough, you'll hear it. For years, Elias had searched for that moment. Some mornings it arrived just before sunrise. Other mornings it waited until the gulls lifted into the air. Today it arrived with the gentle sigh of the wind moving through the beach grass outside his window. He smiled. "There you are," he whispered. Outside, dawn painted the eastern horizon with the faintest ribbon of silver. The stars faded one after another, not disappearing all at once, but slowly giving the sky back to the coming day. Clover, the white cat, stretched lazily beside the fireplace. She blinked twice before deciding the morning required only one important task: following Elias wherever he went. She padded quietly behind him as he stepped outside into the cool morning air. The world felt freshly washed. Tiny droplets of dew rested upon every blade of grass. Spiderwebs sparkled like delicate necklaces between weathered fence posts. The lavender garden held hundreds of tiny beads of water that caught the first rays of sunlight. The fragrance was soft: lavender, salt, fresh earth, sea breeze. Elias believed no perfume in the world could ever be finer. He paused beside the garden gate. Each morning he greeted every living thing around him, not aloud, only quietly within his thoughts. "Good morning, roses. Good morning, lavender. Good morning, little sparrows. Good morning, sea." It was not a ritual anyone had taught him. It simply made the day feel complete. As he approached the lighthouse, the white tower stood peacefully against the brightening sky. The stone walls carried nearly a century of wind and weather upon their surface. Some stones were smooth, others still bore tiny marks left by the hands of the masons who had built the lighthouse long ago. Elias often imagined those builders. They probably never met one another again after the lighthouse was finished, yet every stone they placed remained exactly where they had left it. Their careful work still guided ships decades later. He found something comforting in that thought. Sometimes kindness continued long after the people themselves were gone. Inside the tower, the spiral staircase welcomed him once again. 112 steps. The climb never felt like work. Instead, it felt almost like greeting an old friend. Each step carried its own familiar sound.
Some answered with a gentle creak. Others remained perfectly silent. Sunlight slipped through the narrow windows, creating moving ribbons of gold upon the worn stone walls. Tiny dust particles floated through the beams like countless little stars. By the time Elias reached the lantern room, the sun had fully risen above the Atlantic. The ocean had transformed overnight. Only hours earlier it had been dark as velvet. Now it shimmered with endless silver light. Fishing boats were already leaving the harbor. Their white sails caught the morning breeze like graceful birds unfolding their wings. Elias extinguished the lantern with careful hands. The flame disappeared quietly. No smoke, no sudden darkness, only the gentle understanding that its work had been finished until evening. He removed the glass chimney, cleaned away the smallest trace of soot, polished the brass burner until it reflected his smiling face. Then came his favorite task, the great Fresnel lens. Thousands upon thousands of precisely cut pieces of glass curved together like the petals of a crystal flower. When sunlight passed through the lens, tiny rainbows danced across the lantern room, sometimes blue, sometimes green, sometimes soft gold. Elias watched them for a few quiet moments every morning. He never grew tired of their beauty. Beauty, he believed, never became ordinary simply because one saw it often. Outside, a pair of gulls circled the lighthouse. They seemed to know exactly when the morning cleaning was nearly complete. Every day they landed upon the iron railing surrounding the lantern room. Every day they waited patiently. Every day Elias greeted them with the same warm smile. "I see you've arrived right on time." The gulls tilted their heads as though considering his words. Then one gave a single cheerful cry before lifting back into the wind. Elias laughed softly. Even the birds, he thought, seemed to enjoy keeping a schedule. When his work was finished, he stood quietly beside the open window. The breeze carried sounds upward from the village. Someone splitting firewood, children laughing on their way to school, a blacksmith's hammer ringing steadily against hot iron, the distant bark of a friendly dog. Life was beginning once more, slowly, peacefully, without hurry. The lighthouse watched over it all, as it always had, as it always would. Elias rested one hand upon the smooth brass railing. Some people searched their whole lives for extraordinary adventures. Others crossed oceans in search of distant lands. Yet standing here, high above Cape Cod, he felt as though he already possessed everything he needed. A quiet purpose, a warm cottage, kind neighbors, a faithful cat, and a light that would shine again when evening returned. Sometimes, he thought, happiness was not something waiting somewhere else. Sometimes it was simply the gentle rhythm of an ordinary day, noticed with a grateful heart. The sea sparkled below him. The breeze carried the scent of salt. And somewhere far beyond the horizon, another ship was making its steady way towards home, though neither the sailors nor Elias knew it yet. In time, they would see the lighthouse. In time, its familiar beam would guide them safely. But for now, the morning belonged only to silence, sunlight, and the endless conversation between the wind and the waves. And Elias listened with quiet contentment, as though the sea were telling another story that had begun long before he was born, and would continue long after every lantern had burned its final flame.
The summer days on Cape Cod slipped by so gently that it sometimes seemed impossible to tell where one day ended and another began. Morning followed night. The tide followed the moon. The gulls greeted the sunrise. The lighthouse greeted the evening. Everything moved in quiet harmony, like the slow turning of an old clock that had never once forgotten its purpose. Elias Morgan had come to love these gentle rhythms. He believed that the sea had its own language, not one made of words, but of waves, wind, clouds, and light. Each morning he stepped outside before sunrise and paused upon the weathered stone path leading toward the lighthouse. The air carried a different story every day. Sometimes it smelled of fresh rain drifting across the Atlantic. Sometimes it carried the earthy fragrance of distant marshes warmed by the first light of dawn. Other mornings it smelled only of salt and cool ocean mist, as if the sea itself had risen quietly into the sky.
Elias breathed deeply. There was never any need to rush. The lighthouse had stood here for decades before he arrived. It would almost certainly stand here long after he was gone. There was comfort in knowing that some things asked only for faithful care, never for hurried hands. As he climbed the familiar 112 steps, the wooden treads answered beneath his boots with the same welcoming creaks they had offered every morning. By now, he could almost tell which step came next without looking. The tower had become as familiar to him as the rooms of his own cottage. When he reached the lantern room, the eastern sky had turned the color of pale honey. The ocean below shimmered with ribbons of gold. Fishing boats were already slipping away from the harbor, their sails catching the first gentle breeze. From above, they looked almost like white birds gliding over polished glass. Elias rested his hands upon the cool iron railing outside the lantern room. He watched until the boats became tiny dots upon the endless blue. He wondered about the people aboard them. Each fisherman carried his own hopes for the day. Some hoped for full nets. Some simply hoped for calm weather. Others enjoyed the quiet hours before the world fully awakened. The sea welcomed them all without judgment. It asked only that they respect its changing moods. After cleaning the lantern and polishing the great Fresnel lens until it sparkled with countless tiny reflections, Elias began one of his favorite daily traditions. He opened a small leather notebook that he kept tucked safely inside a wooden cabinet near the lantern. The notebook had once belonged to the lighthouse's first keeper. Its pages had yellowed with age. The corners had softened from years of careful use. Each morning, every keeper had written a few simple observations. The sea calm, wind from the northeast, clear skies, 3 ships passed before noon. Nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary, just quiet moments preserved for someone who might one day read them. Elias smiled as he dipped his pen into a small bottle of ink. His handwriting was careful and neat. July 18, morning calm, gentle breeze from the east. 2 fishing boats departed before sunrise. The sea shines like polished silver. He paused for a moment before adding one final line. The gulls arrived exactly on time. Closing the notebook, he laughed softly to himself. Perhaps no one would ever care about such tiny details, but perhaps those little moments were the ones most worth remembering. Later that morning, as the village slowly came alive, Elias noticed something unusual near the harbor.
A small sailing vessel had arrived during the early hours. Unlike the local fishing boats, its hull was painted a deep forest green. Its sails were neatly folded. Its deck appeared freshly scrubbed. Several travelers stepped onto the wooden dock. Among them was an elderly gentleman wearing a wide-brimmed hat. He walked slowly, leaning upon a polished walking stick made from driftwood. Beside him skipped a young girl of perhaps 9 years old. Her straw bonnet danced in the breeze. She looked everywhere at once. The boats, the girls, the sea, the lighthouse, especially the lighthouse. Her eyes widened. "Grandfather," she whispered, pointing toward the tall white tower, "does someone truly live inside it?" The old gentleman smiled kindly. "Indeed he does." "Does he stay there every night?" "He does. All alone?" "Not entirely. The sea keeps him company." The little girl thought about that answer. It seemed perfectly reasonable. She smiled. "I think I should like to meet someone who lives with the sea."
Elias happened to be walking toward the bakery just then. Mrs. Hathaway stood outside, arranging fresh loaves in the front window. When she noticed the visitors, she welcomed them warmly. "Good morning. Welcome to Cape Cod. We're pleased you've come." The gentleman removed his hat politely. "We've traveled from Boston. My granddaughter has wished to see a lighthouse ever since reading about them." Mrs. Hathaway looked toward Elias. "Well, you've arrived at exactly the right place." She smiled. "Our assistant keeper knows every stair, every lantern, and every gull upon the cape." Elias blushed slightly. "I know most of the gulls." The little girl laughed. "You know birds by name?" "Only the ones who visit every morning." Her eyes grew even brighter. "I'd like to meet them too." There was something wonderfully gentle about her curiosity. She did not ask grand questions. She simply wished to understand the quiet things most people hurried past. Elias recognized that feeling. He had once been exactly the same. After purchasing warm bread and honey cakes, the visitors walked slowly toward the lighthouse. The little girl stopped every few moments. She admired tiny seashells scattered across the path. She watched butterflies drifting above wildflowers. She listened to the wind moving through tall beach grass. Everything fascinated her. The world, Elias thought, always looked different through the eyes of someone seeing it for the first time. When they reached the lighthouse, the little girl gazed upward until her bonnet nearly slipped from her head. "It reaches all the way to the clouds." Elias smiled. "Sometimes it feels that way." "May I climb it?" "If your grandfather doesn't mind." The old gentleman chuckled. "I suspect I'll have to stop for my breath long before she does." Together they began climbing the spiral staircase, 112 familiar steps. The little girl counted every single one. At the top, she stepped into the lantern room and fell completely silent. Morning sunlight streamed through the great Fresnel lens, filling the room with shimmering rainbows, blue, amber, emerald, gold. Tiny colors danced across the polished floorboards. The child reached out carefully, trying to catch one in her hand. "They're beautiful." Elias nodded. "They visit every sunny morning." She looked toward the enormous glass lens. "It looks like a crystal castle." "I've always thought so too." Outside the windows, the Atlantic stretched endlessly beneath the summer sky. The little girl pressed her hands gently against the glass. "I've never seen so much water. It goes on forever." Elias smiled. "It certainly feels that way." For several quiet minutes, no one spoke. There was nothing that needed saying. Sometimes wonder itself was enough. And in that peaceful silence, while the sea breathed softly below and sunlight filled the lantern room with dancing colors, the lighthouse welcomed yet another visitor into its long and gentle story.
By the time late summer arrived upon Cape Cod, the days had begun to change in ways so gentle that only the most careful observer might notice. The mornings carried a cooler breeze. The evenings arrived a little earlier. The sunlight rested lower upon the sea, turning the waves into ribbons of copper and gold before quietly fading into twilight. Elias Morgan noticed every one of these small changes, not because he searched for them, but because life at the lighthouse had taught him to pay attention. The sea was always speaking. The wind was always offering quiet advice. Even the clouds had stories to tell if one was patient enough to listen. On this particular morning, Elias awoke before dawn, just as he always did. The familiar sound of the Atlantic drifted through the open window of his little cottage. Wave after wave rolled gently onto the shore.
Yet beneath that comforting rhythm was something slightly different, a deeper voice, a slower breathing. He stood quietly beside the window for several moments. The air smelled different, less of warm summer salt, more of cool rain carried from somewhere far beyond the horizon. Clover, the faithful white cat, stretched beside the hearth before jumping gracefully onto the windowsill. She looked toward the sea. Her ears twitched. Animals often noticed changes before people did. Elias smiled. "I think you hear it too." The cat blinked slowly, as if agreeing. Outside, the sky remained clear. Only a few pale clouds floated high above the Atlantic. To anyone else, the morning looked perfectly ordinary, but years beside the lighthouse had taught Elias that the sea often whispered before it raised its voice. He stepped onto the stone path leading toward the tower. The wild grass swayed gently in the breeze. The wild roses still bloomed along the fence, though fewer blossoms remained than only a few weeks before. Tiny drops of dew clung to every petal. The lighthouse stood quietly against the fading stars. Its white walls reflected the first silver light of dawn. It appeared as calm and steady as ever. Elias placed his hand upon the cool stone. "Good morning, old friend," he smiled as he always did. Then he climbed the familiar spiral staircase, 112 steps. Each one greeted him like an old companion. At the lantern room, he extinguished the light that had faithfully guided ships throughout the night. He polished the great Fresnel lens until it sparkled. He cleaned the brass fittings, trimmed the wick, checked every mechanism with slow and careful hands. Routine was more than habit. Routine was trust. Every careful task completed today would help someone safely tomorrow. As the sun rose higher, the harbor slowly awakened. Fishing boats prepared to leave. Fishermen greeted one another with cheerful waves. Children walked toward the little schoolhouse, carrying slates beneath their arms. Mrs. Hathaway opened the bakery windows, allowing the warm scent of fresh bread and cinnamon to drift into the morning air. Everything appeared peaceful, yet Elias noticed something unusual. The gulls flew lower than they usually did. Instead of circling high above the lighthouse, they skimmed only a few feet above the water. Even the seals that often rested on the sandbars had disappeared. Nature, he thought, was quietly preparing for something. Not danger, simply change. By afternoon, thin grey clouds had begun gathering far beyond the eastern horizon. They did not rush. They floated patiently toward Cape Cod like enormous ships crossing the sky. The breeze freshened. The beach grass bowed more deeply. The ocean changed from bright sapphire to soft steel blue.
Old Captain Briggs sat outside the harbor, mending one of his fishing nets. Elias stopped to greet him. The old fisherman looked toward the distant horizon before speaking. "Storm tomorrow." Elias followed his gaze. "You think so?" Captain Briggs nodded with quiet certainty. "The sea has already decided." "You can tell." The old man smiled. "I've spent 60 years listening. When you've listened that long, you begin to hear what others miss." Elias looked once more toward the gathering clouds. "They don't seem angry." "No, they're simply traveling. Every storm is only a traveler. It arrives, it stays for a while, and then it moves on." Elias liked that thought. Even storms did not remain forever. That evening, as darkness settled over the Atlantic, the wind carried a gentle hum through the lighthouse railing. It sounded almost like distant music. The lantern was lit at precisely the right moment. Its warm golden beam began its familiar journey across the sea, round and round, patient, steady, faithful. Far offshore, several merchant ships adjusted their course slightly as the light appeared against the deepening night. For countless sailors, the lighthouse meant comfort, it meant direction, it meant that home was growing nearer. Inside the lantern room, Elias watched the beam sweep across the dark water. The approaching clouds slowly covered more and more of the stars. Only a handful remained visible. Still, the lighthouse shone with unwavering confidence. The old tower did not fear cloudy skies. Its purpose remained the same, whether the heavens were filled with stars or hidden behind gentle rain. Hours passed quietly. The wind grew stronger. Rain began with only a few scattered drops tapping softly against the glass. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was strangely comforting. Soon the gentle tapping became a steady rhythm. Rain washed over the lighthouse windows in shimmering silver lines. The Fresnel lens continued turning without interruption. Its brilliant light pierced the rain just as faithfully as it pierced clear skies. Elias smiled. Some people believed courage meant facing great dangers, but standing inside the warm lantern room, listening to the peaceful rain while tending the light, he thought courage might simply mean continuing one's quiet work no matter what weather arrived. Outside, the waves rose a little higher, not wildly, not violently, only enough to remind the shoreline that the sea was forever changing. The lighthouse accepted every season without complaint. Summer sunshine, autumn rain, winter snow, spring mist. Each belonged, each had its place. Near midnight, the rain eased. The wind softened. Clouds slowly drifted westward. One by one, the stars returned. The first appeared directly above the lantern, then another. Soon the familiar constellations stretched across the sky once again. The lighthouse beam welcomed them back as though they had never left. Far below, puddles reflected moonlight between the dunes. The beach grass glistened with countless tiny drops of water. Everything smelled wonderfully fresh. Fresh rain, fresh salt, fresh earth. The world seemed to have taken one long, peaceful breath. Elias opened one of the lantern room windows. Cool night air flowed inside. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called softly. The sea answered with its endless whisper. He closed his eyes for just a moment. Storms, he realized, were not interruptions to peaceful life. They were simply another gentle chapter in the endless conversation between the sky and the sea. And, like every chapter, they always ended with quiet once again. The lighthouse continued its slow, faithful circle beneath the returning stars, reminding every ship upon the Atlantic that no matter how dark the night or how gentle the rain, there would always be a light waiting to guide them home.
The rainstorm had passed as quietly as it had arrived. By morning, Cape Cod seemed brighter than before. The air felt clean and fresh. The ocean sparkled beneath the early sunlight as though thousands of tiny diamonds had been scattered across its surface during the night. Every blade of beach grass carried a small droplet of dew. The wild roses beside the keeper's cottage lifted their blossoms toward the warming sky. The gulls had returned to their familiar circles above the harbor. The seals once again rested upon the distant sandbars. Everything had settled back into its gentle rhythm. Elias Morgan stepped outside just before sunrise. As always, he paused for a moment before beginning the day. He listened. The sea sounded peaceful again. Wave after wave rolled softly toward the shore. The breeze carried the scent of salt, damp pine, and freshly washed earth. He smiled. The old lighthouse stood quietly ahead of him, glowing pale white beneath the first light of dawn. It had watched another night pass, another storm come and go, another sunrise begin. The tower never seemed older, it simply seemed wiser. As Elias climbed the familiar 112 steps, he thought about how many other keepers had walked these same stairs before him. Some had served for only a few years, others for decades. Each had left behind small traces of themselves, a polished brass handle, a carefully repaired wooden step, a handwritten note tucked inside an old logbook. Though their names slowly faded from memory, their kindness remained inside the lighthouse itself. When he reached the lantern room, he opened the great logbook once more. Its leather cover had grown soft with age. Hundreds of pages rested inside, some written in elegant handwriting, others hurriedly recorded during long winter nights. Every page told the quiet story of ordinary days. The wind from the northeast, calm seas, passing schooners, fog before sunrise, a family of whales sighted offshore. One sentence caught Elias's eye. It had been written nearly 50 years earlier. The light shines brightest when tended with a peaceful heart. There was no signature, no explanation, only those simple words. He read them twice, then once more. He gently traced the faded ink with his fingertips. Perhaps the keeper who had written them never imagined someone decades later would pause to read them. Yet here they were, still offering wisdom across time. He carefully closed the book. Outside, the village was beginning to stir. Smoke curled gently from cottage chimneys. Children hurried toward the little schoolhouse. Captain Briggs was already repairing lobster traps beside the harbor. Mrs. Hathaway placed fresh loaves of bread upon the bakery windowsill to cool in the morning breeze. Life continued exactly as it always had, and somehow that constancy felt comforting. Later that afternoon, the little girl and her grandfather returned to visit the lighthouse. The child carried a small basket covered with blue cloth. As soon as she spotted Elias tending the garden beside the keeper's cottage, she waved enthusiastically. "We've brought something." Elias smiled warmly. What might that be? She carefully lifted the cloth. Inside rested a loaf of warm bread, a jar of golden honey, and several bright apples. Grandfather said no lighthouse keeper should ever eat alone. The elderly gentleman chuckled softly. And I have learned that homemade bread tastes even better when shared. Elias thanked them with genuine gratitude. The three of them sat beneath the shade of an old cedar tree overlooking the sea. They shared simple food. Fresh bread, sweet honey, crisp apples, cool well water. There was nothing grand about the meal, yet somehow it felt richer than any banquet. Conversation wandered gently from one subject to another. The little girl asked endless questions. "Have you ever seen whales?" "Oh, many times." "Do dolphins come here?" "They visit every summer." "Have you ever become lonely?" Elias thought for a long moment before answering. "I don't believe so." "Really?" He looked toward the endless Atlantic. "The sea is very good company." "The lighthouse is too." "And the village?" "They've always treated me like family." The little girl nodded thoughtfully. "I think places can become family." Elias smiled. "I believe you're right." The afternoon drifted by as peacefully as the tide itself. Clouds floated lazily across the bright blue sky. Butterflies wandered through the lavender garden. Clover slept beneath the cedar tree, occasionally opening one eye before deciding everything remained perfectly peaceful. Before leaving, the grandfather reached into his coat pocket. He removed a small object wrapped carefully in cloth. "I've carried this for many years." Inside rested an old brass compass. Its polished surface had softened with age. The glass bore tiny scratches from countless journeys. "It belonged to my father," the old man said quietly. "He sailed merchant ships along this coast. He always told me that a compass points north, but a lighthouse points people home." He placed the compass gently into Elias's hands. "I think it belongs here now." Elias looked at the beautiful instrument. "I couldn't possibly accept something so precious." The old gentleman smiled. "It has already served our family well. Now let it become part of another story." For several moments, neither man spoke. Sometimes gratitude was too large for words. That evening, Elias placed the brass compass beside the old logbook inside the lantern room. It seemed perfectly at home there. Two objects, both carrying memories, both quietly connecting one generation to another. As sunset painted the Atlantic with shades of amber, rose, and soft lavender, Elias lit the great lantern once again. The familiar golden beams swept across the water, round and round, patient, steady, faithful. Far below, children walking home from the village looked up toward the lighthouse. One little boy tugged gently at his mother's hand. "Will that light always be there?" His mother smiled. "I hope so. But even if someday another keeper lights it, someone will always care for it." The boy seemed satisfied with that answer. He waved toward the tower. Though Elias could not see him from above, the gesture somehow felt received. The lighthouse had become more than stone, more than glass, more than flame. It had become a promise, quietly passed from one generation to the next. A promise that someone would remain awake while others slept. A promise that kindness could be as constant as the turning tide. A promise that every traveler, no matter how far they had wandered, deserved a welcoming light waiting patiently upon the shore. As darkness settled over Cape Cod, stars slowly appeared above the Atlantic once more. The sea whispered its endless lullaby. The lighthouse answered with its gentle circle of light. And somewhere far beyond the horizon, another ship quietly altered its course, guided home by the faithful lantern that had already watched over so many generations before, and would continue to do so for many generations yet to come. Autumn arrived upon Cape Cod almost without announcement. No trumpet sounded. No great change happened overnight. Instead, the season came quietly, one gentle morning at a time. The sunrise lingered a little later behind the horizon. The evening shadows stretched a little farther across the dunes. The breeze carried the cool fragrance of pine, cedar, and the first fallen leaves. The Atlantic remained faithful, rising and falling with its endless rhythm, just as it had through every season before. Elias Morgan welcomed the new days with the same quiet gratitude that had guided him throughout the year. Some mornings he stood outside the keeper's cottage before dawn and simply watched the eastern sky brighten. He had discovered long ago that no two sunrises were ever exactly alike. Some arrived wrapped in soft silver mist. Others painted the sea with glowing shades of rose and amber. Occasionally, the clouds became great golden mountains floating across the horizon. Every dawn was a gift that asked for nothing in return except to be noticed. Clover, now a little older and perhaps a little wiser, still followed Elias wherever he went. Her steps had become slower. She paused more often in patches of warm sunlight. Yet every evening, just before the lantern was lit, she climbed the familiar hill beside the lighthouse and waited patiently, as though she understood the importance of that quiet moment. The villagers often smiled when they saw her. "The little keeper is reporting for duty," Mrs. Hathaway would say with a laugh. Captain Briggs always tipped his cap toward the white cat. Even the school children had begun calling her Guardian Clover. She accepted every greeting with the calm dignity that only cats seemed able to possess. Life upon the Cape continued its peaceful rhythm. Fishing boats left before sunrise. Fresh bread cooled upon bakery windows. Children chased one another through the village square. The blacksmith's hammer rang steadily each afternoon. Smoke curled gently from cottage chimneys as evenings grew cooler. Nothing seemed hurried, nothing felt forgotten. It was as though the entire village had quietly learned the lesson Elias had come to treasure most. The happiest days were rarely the loudest ones. One crisp October afternoon, a group of children from the village school arrived at the lighthouse carrying notebooks and tiny wooden stools. Their teacher, Miss Eleanor Whitmore, smiled warmly. "We've come for today's lesson." Elias looked pleasantly surprised. "At the lighthouse?" Miss Whitmore nodded. "History is easier to understand when children can stand where history lives." The children eagerly gathered around the old stone tower. Some looked upward toward the lantern room. Others examined the weathered stones near the foundation. One little boy gently placed his hand upon the wall. "It feels warm." "The sun has been visiting all afternoon," Elias replied. The children laughed softly. Inside the lantern room, sunlight poured through the great Fresnel lens, scattering tiny rainbows across the wooden floor. The children gasped. "It looks like magic." Elias smiled. "I thought exactly the same thing when I first climbed these stairs." One curious girl raised her hand. "Who built this lighthouse?" Elias rested his hand upon the brass railing. "Many skilled builders, stonemasons, carpenters, blacksmiths, glassmakers, men whose names most people no longer remember." The children grew quiet. "But every time this light shines, their work continues." Another child asked, "Will someone take care of it after you?" Elias looked toward the sea before answering. "I certainly hope so, but I believe every lighthouse chooses its next keeper." The children smiled at the idea. The old tower seemed almost alive. And perhaps, in some quiet way, it truly was. As evening approached, the school children helped with small chores around the lighthouse grounds. Some gathered fallen leaves from the garden. Others carried fresh firewood to the cottage. A few carefully watered the late autumn flowers that still bloomed beside the stone path. They worked happily together, talking quietly and laughing from time to time. No one hurried. There was no need. When the chores were finished, Elias thanked each child personally. "You've cared for this place today. Someday you'll care for other places. A family, a farm, a ship, a school, whatever it may be. Care for it kindly." Those simple words remained with the children long after they returned home. That evening, the sky became wonderfully clear. The first stars appeared long before darkness had fully settled. The moon rose slowly above the Atlantic, casting a silver path across the calm water. The lighthouse waited. As always. At precisely the right moment, Elias climbed the final steps, carrying his lantern. The brass burner gleamed. The glass chimney sparkled. Everything was ready. He struck a single match. Its tiny flame flickered gently in the cool autumn air. Then the great lantern awakened once more. Golden light filled the room. The magnificent Fresnel lens gathered every ray, strengthened it, focused it, and sent it sweeping gracefully across the endless Atlantic, round and round and round again. Patient, steady,
faithful. The same quiet promise it had offered every evening for generations. Far beyond the horizon, sailors looked toward that familiar beam. Some were returning from distant ports. Others carried families they had not seen in many months. Some were young on their very first voyage. Others had crossed the Atlantic so many times that they could almost recognize the lighthouse by the rhythm of its turning light alone. To each of them, the lantern offered the same silent message. You are not alone. Home is waiting. Keep going. Elias stood beside the great lens, watching its warm glow travel over the sea. The brass compass given to him by the old traveler rested quietly beside the lighthouse logbook. The pages of that weathered book now held years of his own careful handwriting alongside the words of the keepers who had come before him. Generation after generation, keeper after keeper. One light, one purpose. Outside, the Atlantic whispered its endless lullaby. The waves reached the shore, then gently returned, again and again, just as they always had, just as they always would. The lighthouse stood quietly against the starlit sky, no longer simply a tower of stone and glass, but a symbol of gentle service, quiet kindness, and faithful hope. Its light would continue long after one keeper's footsteps had faded. Others would climb the same 112 stairs. Others would polish the same magnificent lens. Others would pause beside the window and listen to the sea breathing below. And perhaps, without ever knowing his name, they would feel grateful for the careful hands that had tended the light before them. Because that is how kindness travels through time. Not with great celebration, not with loud applause, but quietly, patiently, from one heart to another, from one generation to the next. So if you ever find yourself standing beside the sea, and somewhere in the distance you notice the slow, comforting sweep of a lighthouse beam across the dark water, perhaps you'll think of Elias Morgan, of Clover faithfully waiting outside, of the peaceful village nestled among the dunes, and of a lighthouse that never hurried, never complained, and never failed to shine when evening came. Now the stars fill the sky. The waves continue their timeless song. The lantern turns its gentle circle over the sleeping Atlantic, and the whole of Cape Cod settles peacefully into the quiet embrace of the night. May your dreams be as calm as the sea beneath the starlit sky, and may there always be a light to guide you gently home. The end.